Welcome, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd, Director of Programs at the Tenant Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation on Jane Jacobs' First City, Learning from Scranton. Tonight's program is part of our series of conversations with authors and writers, where we look at topics related to the work that we do here at our tenement buildings on Orchard Street. And tonight's book is for sale through the Tenant Museum's shop, through the link that will be in the chat. And we want to hear from you tonight. So please share your questions, your connections to the conversation in the chat, and we'll be able to keep you part of the conversation. We really are committed to continuing programs like this one. So if you're able, please make a donation to the Tenement Museum of any amount in the link in the description of the event. So glad to have you all here with us and look forward to hearing your questions and connections. We're honored to be joined by Glenna Lang, author of Jane Jacobs' First City, for really a look at her work on this formative period in Jane Jacobs' life and how Jane came to understand cities from her time in Scranton. So perhaps many of you are familiar, but Jane Jacobs, she's most well known for her work developing ideas about urban planning in New York. And what's interesting for the Tenement Museum and for our work is that really the Lower East Side, both in the 1960s when Jane was working in New York and today, is really the type of neighborhood that Jane came to champion. It's walkable, it's diverse, it's full of different types of buildings with different types of uses. And in some ways, you could even say that the Tenement Museum exists because of Jane Jacobs. In 1962, she actually began organizing against a highway project. And that highway project would have, had it gone through, resulted in the demolition of many blocks of buildings in Lower Manhattan, including the block with 97 Orchard Street, which is today, of course, home to the Tenement Museum and where the museum began. So, the work of Jane Jacobs is very deeply connected to the work that we do every day at the Tenement Museum, sharing stories of people who lived in tenements, who lived in the Lower East Side. And we're really thrilled to be here with Glenna Lang to see just how Jane's time in Scranton shines light on Scranton, on Jane Jacobs, and in some ways on cities and places like the Lower East Side. So Glenna, welcome. We're so glad to have you here tonight.
Thank you. I'm just thrilled to be here also. And that was a wonderful way to point out the connection between Jane and this wonderful museum.
Yeah, I was, it's just such an amazing connection when you think through just how crucial her work was in shaping the neighborhood and just how we see cities. So I do want to start out, if viewers aren't familiar with Jane Jacobs, what are the most important things to know about her and her work before we dive into the book itself?
Well, first and foremost, Jane was a writer and an analyzer of her observations. And she always wanted to be a writer, and she was always interested in cities. And to add to that aspect of her, she couldn't help but become involved in causes that she learned about through her observations. And she had been active once in Scranton when she was a young person who was freelancing here as a writer in New York. But then again, when her own neighborhood and vicinities near her were in jeopardy of being victims of urban renewal. So she was a writer and activist.
Right. And I really, I love just the way we can see Jane as a writer first and really becoming an activist through what she was seeing in her work as a writer and journalist. And I think that really helps us understand how she was really seeing the work of cities and of being fluent, if you will, in what cities were like. She was coming to that work from a different background than other people were at the time. And certainly your book takes a very long view, a very unique view on Jane Jacobs' life and her time growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, what she experienced there, how her childhood helped shaped her ideas later in life. And I'm curious though, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. I grew up in a number of different places, but by the time I was starting school and through high school, I lived in New York and I lived in Queens. I really wished that I could have lived in the village, but that was not to be. And instead, before I could go into the quote city, as it was called then myself, I liked to get together with one of my very best friends, and we would wander around Queens. Our parents didn't know that, and but we loved the industrial areas, and I also lived not too far, or I could walk to LaGuardia Airport, and we would go down and watch the planes come in and out. So it was a personal experiencing of the city that enticed me, which is actually what enticed Jane as well.
Yeah, I love that, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the conversation. But I personally feel a very similar, connection to what you just shared of just the way that observing and walking around a city can help you start to think about the bigger forces that have shaped that city, and who lives there and why, and what gets built there and why. And so I think it's helpful inspiration to see that you took that and
Mm.
applied that curiosity to then this incredibly detailed portrait of Jane Jacobs and her life. So, thinking about the book and the work that you did, Jane was born in Scranton in 1916. So, what was Scranton like at that time when she was growing up there?
Well, it's hard for people to imagine if they know Scranton now and that general area and other cities like Scranton. But Scranton was in 1916 the third largest city in Pennsylvania, right after Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And it was thriving. It had movie theaters, it was a tryout place for theater for New York. It was only 2 hours away, still is, from Scranton. It had excellent schools. Uh, it, had a fair number of people still. It had arts. It had libraries. It was a place that people wanted to move to and where they could start businesses, and her father, who was a doctor, could start a practice. And her parents had no connection there, but they
Right, because her
decided to
family
move there.
moved there, right? That
They
that they in
did.
fact moved from another part of the United States to Scranton. So it was a time when many people were moving to Scranton. And what was drawing people to Scranton in
I
that
think
time?
it was a sense of opportunity. I mean, it was the anthracite hard coal capital of the world, really, certainly of the United States, and there were lots of jobs. There that was so important then, and it made for a nice life. There were nice houses of all sorts being built, different places, kinds of places for people to live, a range of opportunities from working in the mines, which it wasn't the greatest opportunity, but it was for some people that was actually desirable, and then others could, open small businesses. Others could be bankers. It
Mm-hmm.
was really quite a range,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah,
So there was really a range of types of jobs that people could do in Scranton, and different types of industry that were drawing people there at the time.
yes, yes.
And you know, what can we understand about the size of Scranton at that time? You said it's the third largest city in Pennsylvania at the time. How might we compare it to a city like New York in 1916?
No, it's
Or you can say the
much.
size of what it was in Scranton, and I'll try to do the calculation of
Well,
what's
at its
comparison to New
peak,
York.
it had about 140,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
But what was kind of interesting about Scranton's geography was that it was surrounded by hills and low mountains, sort of Poconos on one side, and it sat in the bottom of a bowl, which meant that people lived very close to one another. So it was concentrated. There was a density, and different kinds of people were not separated from one another. So on your one block, you were likely to have someone who owned a big manufacturing business and a laborer at the same time, and people from all countries and all walks of life.
That's really interesting because in New York, I mean, certainly just within the Lower East Side, you do see in the same time period in 1916, the Lower East Side as a neighborhood was diverse, but was diverse in understanding the neighborhood as a Jewish neighborhood predominantly. So diverse within, what we see as people thinking about what it means to be Jewish, but it was really a particular immigrant community, immigrants and their children. And, you don't have the same kind of economic diversity or racial diversity in the Lower East Side in 1916. So helpful to just contrast, what is Jane growing up in, what's happening in New York City at the same time period. And
so one other example of that is there was only one, or that's not true. There were two high schools in Scranton for the entire city. And one was what they called classical high school for college-bound individuals, and the other was technical for people who were going into a trade. But one was not necessarily better than the other. They were just different. They were both excellent. But can you imagine New York having two high schools?
Two high schools.
That's a great difference in scale.
Right. Many thousands of people in each, if New York only had two at that time period. So certainly, right, the Lower East Side had more than two high schools at that time. So thinking about what Scranton was like in this time, how did Jane's childhood shape her as a person? What inspired her about Scranton?
She loved diversity, and that means diversity of all kinds. She loved all the different kinds of things people were doing. She liked to see that. She loved knowing that they were from different countries or different backgrounds. You could get to know your government and understand how that worked. Things were just accessible, and it was easy to go downtown. I mean, she, from the time she was 5, lived a little bit further out. She lived in kind of like legally the next town, but it was really an extension of Scranton. And she could walk the maybe mile and a half to downtown, but she could also take the streetcar, and it was a quick and easy ride. And there's even a little story in the book that Jane told during various times in her life about how she didn't mind going to the dentist at all. In fact, she rather looked forward to it because she got to go downtown. And then when she was old enough to go into town by herself, she and her friends went and watched the trains come in at the beautiful train station. So there's so much to do.
One of the true signs of a budding urban planner, right, is someone watching transportation. And I think that really comes out in your research, is just the way Jane, from a very young age, is seeing herself as part of the city and is engaging with whether it's transportation or the businesses or different neighborhoods, that she is really part of both her particular neighborhood and her sort of wider city. And certainly, as we'll talk a little bit about later, is due to the size of Scranton. But I'm curious, did you sort of find anything about sort of her family and her parents that encouraged this kind of engagement with the city, or sort of gave her this mindset and curiosity?
Well, They decidedly wanted to live in a city, even though neither of them was from a city to begin with. I think they also were excited by it, and they had wide interests. Her entire family were great readers, and that was one of the big activities. And Jane read about everything. She always had her nose in a book, people used to comment. And the other thing was, we're talking about before radio was even big, and certainly before television at all, and people instead joined clubs or groups. And for Jane, being a member of Girl Scouts and therefore meeting girls from other parts of the city and other communities around the city, that was a really valuable, meaningful, and exciting experience for her. It's a huge part of her life.
That really struck me as making a lot of sense, right? If you know about Jane Jacobs and just her commitment to people and community, it made perfect sense to me that she would be a Girl Scout from a young age. And also important to see how her participation in a group like that just connected her to people from different backgrounds, from different parts of the city.
And she also had an ability to be a leader. It was a natural talent. And I don't think she herself particularly wanted to be a leader, but people looked to her. And the Girl Scouts were a very egalitarian organization, and she really became quite a character there, quite a focus. They appreciated her.
That's also, right, what we see sort of later when she really takes on these sort of leadership roles within activist movements and sort of leading the way, but bringing others along with her. I'm also just thinking about her parents in the 19 teens liking cities, and in fact moving to a city is quite notable, right? Were her parents immigrants themselves? I don't recall.
Not at all.
Yeah. So I think we tend to think a lot about people moving, like immigrants or migrants, right? People moving to the city for particular financial opportunities. But it seems like Jane's parents were moving there for something different that the city offered.
But they were searching for an economic opportunity, because her father was from a relatively modest background. He was his family owned a small farm in Virginia, in very rural Virginia, and he had ambitions. And the mother had come from a good family with a prominent lawyer as a father, and she wanted to she had ambition. She became a school teacher and then a nurse. Their parents met in Philadelphia. So it was a very serious discussion as to where they were going to move. And it had to be a city, because that's where the opportunities were.
I think that's so important to note. Certainly, this is a time period when, in the eyes of many Americans, cities are to be reviled, right? Cities are being seen by many as places to be fixed and changed. You have public health crises, particularly in New York City, and a lot of progressive era reforms that are shaping what cities look like in this same time period. So I just think it's really important to note that Jane's parents liked cities and chose to move to Philadelphia, move to Scranton, and commit themselves. Certainly, as there were plenty of Americans who were doing the same thing, but it's in this time period when there really is a conversation about how, as a wider society, do we identify issues in cities and solve for them. And many people, right, had very negative perspectives on cities. So
but Scranton was too new and too relatively small to be in that situation. It was still a burgeoning growing city.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it had its poorer districts, but they weren't seen as slums.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So also really, really crucial in thinking about then how her time in Scranton compares to her work in New York, right? What was she seeing growing up in a relatively new developing city compared to New York City? So that's just really also just fascinating, right? To think about, her parents making that decision. And
But she loved New York. I mean, New York was the lure for her from the time she was 12, and she just, I think, by the time she had graduated high school, she was ready for even more. And
mm-hmm.
New York was the magnet.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
And I do definitely want to come back to that in a few minutes, but um, Jane is not known for having formal training in urban
Mm.
planning. And, we really started by, thinking about her as a writer. But she ends up developing really ideas that are essential for urban planners today and that sort of are much more broadly accepted than they were in the time when she was working. So, we've touched on this a little bit so far, but how is she learning about cities? What is her process? How does she sort of see the importance of observing or walking or listening? Tell us a little bit more about how she's understanding how you learn
Well,
about cities and how she hones
well,
that
you've
process.
stated it perfectly, because the thing that was most important to her was observation. And it's a very it's an empowering skill, because anybody can develop it. And the Girl Scouts had actually put in their handbook an entire chapter on observation, and it was both of nature and of cities. And so she felt that by observing, she could understand how cities work, what makes them good cities, what makes them have problems. And it's all there by watching. So when she
Mhm.
got to Greenwich Village, she had her wonderful window to peer out and study the sidewalk ballet.
Which
But
of she, I think, probably the most famous concept that she
yeah, yeah.
sort of brought us in how we think about cities, right?
But but first and foremost, she wanted to understand how they worked, and that was through the observation. And then she came to see that there were people known as urban planners who were interfering
Mhm.
in a bad way, to put it
Mhm.
simplistically. So,
Well, glad you touched on that actually, because we already have a question from the audience about one of those people who was seen as an urban planner at the time. So this is skipping ahead in Jane's life a little bit, but I think very relevant to what we're touching on now. In your research and sort of work on Jane Jacobs, would you say that Jane's experience growing up with diverse backgrounds in Scranton, did that play a role in her time in New York and her sort of, she's most perhaps famous for her fight against Robert Moses,
mhm.
and sort of his role as a planner in New York City.
So how did growing up in Scranton affect?
Yeah, or would you
Well,
say, do you see any connection, right, in sort of that particular fight that she ends up sort of staging very publicly against Robert Moses and her experience growing up around people of different backgrounds in Scranton?
well, she certainly valued all kinds of diversity enormously, and she saw that in New York in a grander way than in Scranton, because whatever number of groups of people Scranton had, New York had them, in dozens. And so I think Moses ran counter to all that. I mean, he did not want to preserve the old. He thought cities were vile places, really. It's he personified what she didn't think worked in a city. And it's very important to have a continuity of old and new. Old buildings give you new possibilities for uses. They can be repurposed. They give a fabric to the city. Uh, Moses did not appreciate that at all. He didn't appreciate what immigrants had to offer and what people of lesser means had to offer, which was community. And community was an aspect of Scrantonian life that she uh, thought, was of utmost importance. There's a total sense of community in Scranton, and even people who didn't agree or were from very different backgrounds came together for common purposes.
And we really see, right? She championed this idea of community in New York, and it sounds from your work, right, that this was really informed by her time in Scranton. But how did Jane think about this word community? Like, what would you say it meant to her? Certainly, people coming together around common causes. Is there anything else that sort of in your work helped inform the way Jane was thinking about that?
I think there were all sorts of communities. People could recombine for different purposes, but she also appreciated chance encounters with people. That was something that she spoke about, and that you would get to know people that you otherwise wouldn't get to know just from passing them on the street or going to school with them, or all sorts of possible ways. But there was a sense of certain things were important to everybody, and that there was an obligation for people to help one another in every way possible. And an example of that was the community chest, which was conducted once a year annually, and everybody in the city was either going to be helped by it or would help other people. And even sometimes those who were helped in turn helped others. But it didn't matter who you were, you threw yourself into that, from school children to the elderly. And it's something that's excuse me, almost inconceivable to us today, I think. And when there was a polio epidemic in the early in the I guess late teens, the mayor actually put a notice in the paper and asked all of the city's doctors to come to a meeting and put their heads together and figure out what to do. And they did. I mean, that seems like an incredible concept to us now.
Truly incredible. I mean, even within a neighborhood like the Lower East Side today, right? There's so many different communities, even within the medical community in the Lower East Side, that thinking about one meeting of all of the doctors in a city is at a very different scale, of course.
And I'm sure that they had different points of view, and they did. They had arguments at the various meetings for this, but they were civil, and they came to conclusions and agreements. And they even did things like that at Girl Scouts, where the governance was conducted in that kind of way.
Right. And you really sort of point out in the book about how conversations like that are motivated by this sense of civic pride
and responsibility
that people have towards this place and the people who live there. And the idea of the community chest was really just really, really inspiring to read about, just thinking of the mutual aid that we've seen throughout the pandemic and how people have come together to help each other financially, to see how Scranton was doing that throughout the whole city, and that people are contributing, are receiving aid from this, and it's a way of thinking about community and financial support is really key.
And the newspaper contributed to that as well. And I mean the newspaper as an overall institution, there were, there was at least a morning daily and an evening daily, And then there were some smaller ones. There were weeklies, there were newspapers in other languages, but there was a sense of responsibility by the press to not only report the news, accurately, but also to report on everybody. So if you were a kid and you were in a piano recital, that was likely to be reported in more than one newspaper. And you could be African American. If you went out of town to visit a relative who was sick, that would be in the newspaper. I mean, the comings and goings of people, the achievements of, children or adults or little awards. It was a wonderful thing. And it made you proud if you got into the newspaper.
Absolutely. I mean, and really just putting, emphasis behind this idea that everyone matters.
Exactly.
Everyone is part of this place. Everyone's story deserves to be in the newspaper. Just thinking about people's comings and goings being reported in the newspaper, I imagine it's a lot of involvement in your life, but you can see how that cultivates a sense of pride in this place and in investment in
Absolutely.
the sense of community. And we have a related question from the audience, just thinking about both the idea of neighborhoods and diversity and the idea of community. You mentioned, right, that neighborhoods were mixed at the time, but was there any sense that Scranton's neighborhoods were organized around particular immigrant communities or ethnicities?
A little bit. There, but the south part of Scranton is separated by a river, basically, and what's called South Side was more of an immigrant community, but it wasn't one group of immigrants. It was many different ones. And there was one section that was called the Hill, where some of the coal barons lived. But at the end of their block, there was likely to be a cluster of houses where people of much lesser means lived. And there was what's called a coal patch. A patch is a neighborhood of miners, which was just a couple blocks away. And the town, I guess, visually and economically, I should point this out, but anthracite mining was the main component of the economy, and the city was dotted with these giant breakers, which are the sort of ladders that the coal goes down to be sorted, and coal dumps, which are the whatever the refuse of coal,
waste.
Where it's mixed with rock, giant mountains of that, and this is dotting the city, so you were never far from a coal breaker. So that really colors a town. It gives it a feel. You're reminded of what the town relies on, and it's ultimately was Scranton's downfall in a lot of ways as well. And Jane watched all this. I mean, she watched the economic process as well as the physical process and the people and
that's right.
Aspects.
I mean, right. She's looking at all the different layers of a city and what makes the city tick economically, socially, and right. So much of her work sort of informs the way we see those different dynamics interact within cities today. And is certainly unique, right? Thinking about Scranton as having almost, it seems like one area where immigrants are living, regardless of background, compared to a huge city like New York, where you have, what develops into Little Italy, sort of next to what develops into the Jewish Lower East Side, even those they're, more diverse than just Italian or Jewish, but where you sort of have a little bit more of a a neighborhood of immigrants. So it seems quite different in Scranton. And,
It's more variegated,
mhm,
I would
mhm,
say.
mhm. Um, and it sounds like too non-immigrants in Scranton have more day-to-day overlap and connection, perhaps
Yes.
with
Yes.
immigrants than what we might see in the same time period in New York City. So how do you see that sort of that dynamic inform Jane's ideas about the value of immigrants within a city?
Well, she went to high school and grade school as well with immigrants. And she uh, was very good friends with people of all different backgrounds. And so she experienced or got to view their life firsthand. She did have children of coal miners in both high school and grade school. And she saw people grow up and go to college and become successful, who come from very hard scrabble backgrounds. So and also as far as race went in Scranton, there was a really cohesive, but small, relatively small number of African Americans, and they were at Scranton Central and Scranton Tech high schools as well, and she worked with them.
Yeah,
So
and that's also quite
I
you know
think
particular and interesting also for this time period, right? It's like New York at this period and still today is quite racially segregated. And you do write about in Scranton how African Americans are part of the wider fabric of the city. But was the city racially segregated in any
which
way?
Philadelphia was, but Scranton was not. And I've talked with people who've grown up in other places, such as Newark. My mother grew up in Atlantic City, which had one central high school like that, and her experience was very similar to Jane's. So it's not unheard of. I don't mean to make it sound like that, but it is the difference, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but between a great, which means both wonderful and enormous, city like New York. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a different animal, and
Mm-hmm.
I think uh, Jane Jane appreciated the value of that much, later in her life. I think it should not be ignored that when Jane was growing up, uh, she was determined that she was going to go to New York as soon as she could.
Yeah, so
Um,
let's get into that a little bit more. It was really my next question of just
uh-huh.
so you shared that Jane really from a young age knew that she wanted to leave and go to New York. But sort of what finally motivates her to make that move, and then how did she engage with her hometown once she was in New York? What is that
Mm.
dynamic like for her? I think this is certainly we see so many people moving from other cities in the U.S. to New York City today. So curious how that looked for Jane.
Well, I mean, she wasn't suddenly moved to do it. She tells a woman who interviewed her for a book that she was doing where Jane's poetry was published, and she was very much an aspiring poet in high school, and she tells the woman, the first thing I want to do is I want to be a journalist. And she did that before she left Scranton. She basically had a kind of quasi internship at the morning paper, and then she went off to New York to try her hand as a freelance writer.
Mm.
So it was in her plan. Um,
To go to New York.
she's
Very,
been
very relatable feeling, right?
Yes, and many people heard her say what her plans were, and they didn't. She didn't waver. Her mind was made up. Her parents wanted her to go to college, and she said, no, thank you. they insisted that she get some real world skills. She learned stenography and secretarial skills, and so that she could earn a living when she got there. And that's what she did. So she followed her plan. I don't think she ever regretted it. But I think that she did find that she was attached to her city. And, sometimes maybe you appreciate a place more once you've left it. And,
and that's, I'm interested in that. Did she go back to visit Scranton frequently when she was in New York? Does she stay? She stays connected to it?
Well, and she did through the late 40s or mid to late 40s. And then by then she had 3 siblings, and they had all moved. Her sister had moved to New York right before her. So her sister's plan was clearly to go to New York as well. And but once her siblings and her mother had all gone, her father had died, and her mother moved to be with the older son, whom she thought would never move again. He was in Virginia, but he did end up moving. But so when she didn't have those ties, it was a little, there's less actually drawing her back. And there was a sort of time when her connections weren't as strong. And I think she was, she had at that point a family of her own, and she had one of her brothers married a Scranton girl, his high school sweetheart, and that kept her connected a bit. And they would exchange clippings. The Scranton connected brother would send her news, and she clearly enjoyed it. Sometimes she would make sarcastic remarks and stuff. I'll be honest.
But I mean, interesting to see, right, how she's relating to her hometown over the course of her really formative point in her career in New York City, and what that connection was like for her. And then, as you mentioned, she then later in life sort of reflects more on Scranton and how its sort of size and uniqueness, kind of made for some of these qualities that she really came to value in a city. So, what was that process like for her? How did she sort of come to see Scranton later in life?
Well, I think distance can be a wonderful thing too. And once her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is published, she does kind of a book tour, and she visits a lot of cities in the States and even overseas. And she has all sorts of invitations to speak at places, and she always studies them when she visits. She wants to go out and see the neighborhoods and what they're really like. And I think it really broadened her horizons, and I think eventually she must have thought about her own city again. Even though it's like a parent-child relationship in a way. It had to be broken before it could be revisited and find the good things in it. And so she, let's see, she, I think next goes to her 50th high school reunion. And that seemed sort of surprising to people at the time, like her kids who knew her, who often heard her, say negative things about Scranton and how claustrophobic it was. But I think the fact that she was ready to go back, that's 1983, I believe. Yeah, that's her high school reunion. And then she has a little bit of a stronger connection, and really does start pondering what value Scranton has, what it has to teach us. And
what did she ultimately conclude of what Scranton has to teach us?
I think she saw the value of a smaller city, what can be accomplished in that size entity. And in Toronto, where she moved in 1968 because of the Vietnam War and the draft and her sons and all that. In Scranton, the city was always talking about amalgamation, meaning making Toronto an even bigger city than it was. And she thought that was a terrible idea. And in fact, she had a strong opinion about New York having, I don't know what the technical term is for it, I can't remember, in New York, but the uniting under one city government of the five boroughs. And she thought that was a really bad idea. She had actually lived in Brooklyn when she first got to New York. She and her sister had an apartment there, and she thought it was really, really bad for Brooklyn, which had been a great city in its own right, and that everything was just had gotten too unwieldy to govern. Too many different interest groups, too many warring factions. Not that ability to come together for cleanup week, or boys week or girls week, or things that the whole city could celebrate. And that was not possible. And she remembered a place where it was.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we've just had a question from the audience of just how her views of Scranton shaped her views of New York, and how her views of New York shaped her views of Scranton. And I think you really just helped look at that of her experiences in New York, and seeing how difficult it could be to affect change at a large scale, to understand city government. I was really just drawn to the comment you made earlier about just how a smaller size government is easier to know and understand the processes by which change happens, or elected officials make decisions.
And you can have a personal relationship with it. It's very likely that some family member or friend will know, the city council member, or even the mayor, might come from your neighborhood.
Yeah, and just the importance of local politics, which certainly in New York City is also so crucial, but to many, can feel, too large to become involved in. And, that she really champions people in New York City to be involved and to understand local politics. So you can really see how her experience in a smaller city with a smaller city government kind of impacts that. And then, I think just your note too on sort of the flip side, I'm glad you did mention just how she might have felt claustrophobic in Scranton, and like what are the limits of a small place, and how she in living in both places perhaps came to see them both differently, and certainly value Scranton anew once she was older.
So, and you said something in there that touched on something I should have included, but I spend a certain amount of time in the book showing how a lot of the things, or really each of the things that she defines in Death and Life, were things that she had seen in Scranton. So she talks about long blocks versus short blocks, and she had seen that in New York, and that's a big one of the components, and there it is in Scranton. She talks about mixed uses and how important that is in New York. Well, she had seen that in Scranton. Each one of those things, and I think it may even have been somewhat subconscious. But although she does in one of her later books say, or in a later interview, that actually all of these things that I identified in New York existed in Scranton. So in my
so we
own
see
city,
very clear, absolutely very clear.
Later.
Even if even if she wasn't necessarily aware of it at the time, sort of this later reflection of all of these elements that she has come to see as part of a healthy city, and one that is vibrant and thriving, and create beneficial experiences for its residents, were sort of present in Scranton.
Yeah.
And I do also just want to touch on your process because, throughout at least this conversation, we've gotten to see the incredible level of detail that and that you researched into Scranton and Jane's life there. There's just really painstaking, incredibly beautiful detail throughout the whole book. And tell us a little bit about your process. I mean, what was your process like
Oh my goodness.
for this book, and in particular, because we work so much with oral histories at the museum, if you could talk a little bit about just how you interviewed people in Scranton today to learn about Jane Jacobs.
Well, this was a long sleuthing, and I felt kind of like a detective because it wasn't as if Scranton's history or any of this was readily available. Scranton had gotten to such a place where I think it didn't have any pride in itself. It had torn down so many beautiful buildings, and there I am trying to find out what it was like in the 1920s and 30s. When Jane was growing up and going into the census and trying to reconstruct who her classmates were. And I mean, I was so fortunate. After I had given a talk there in 2011 for the previous book that I had done as a young adult book for Jane, as a kind of an empowerment book, I had been asked to give a talk in Scranton. And a 95-year-old classmate of Jane's got in touch with me and said, I want to tell you, I have so many things I want to tell you. So I was lucky in the beginning of the research to have people who had actually known her. So interviews were really important, but it was putting little shards of evidence, a line from the newspaper, plus census records, and understanding who each of her 25 classmates was in 8th grade, that sort of thing, reconstructing the world. And interviews were wonderful, to find people who had such amazing memories. And I was so fortunate to discover a woman named Dorothy Walker Smith, who's 98 today, African-American, one of the best memories I've ever seen in my life.
I loved reading about her in the book. It was really incredible.
And what a viewpoint, what a character. And she was my entree into actually a number of communities, African-American, Jewish, you name it. And it showed how these communities had overlapped and really supported one another.
And also certainly just the power of continuity within a place, that she lived in Scranton for so many decades and had then through her memories really was able to share history. And for me, that particular part of the book really reinforced then also what Jane Jacobs really came to champion, of just the importance of memory to how we understand a place, and how that continuity from generation to generation, even as you welcome newcomers into a community, how longtime residents really become anchors for a place.
They absolutely do, and they are so essential. I think well, Jane eventually felt that the way to deal with what we now call gentrification was to keep that continuity of people there, so that everybody doesn't exit, that there are enough old timers to bridge the transition from one generation to another, and keep stories alive. And they're just invaluable. And little school records, I went to lots of public schools looking for records, and the local library had certain things that hardly anyone had looked at. And there's some other people there who really have taken an interest, and They're pillars.
Yeah, right. And I mean, certainly, you mentioned to me earlier that this book sort of invigorated the connection again between Jane Jacobs and Scranton, and that
Yes.
people living there now are sort of connecting to her and her lessons anew. So that seemed like an incredibly powerful outcome of your research and sort of your work into this place and this woman, that you could connect the dots and
Oh,
for
thank you.
residents who might not have known who she was.
Yeah, of which there were many. So I think the city was able to take pride in Jane Jacobs, which at one point it did not have. So,
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
mm-hmm.
So,
That's great. Well, we have one last question from the audience here, which you touched on a little bit earlier, but one of the viewers wants to know what in particular influenced you to write this book about Jane Jacobs' formative years in Scranton. And I'll add to that I think you mentioned briefly, but you've actually written, is it two other books about Jane Jacobs?
just one, and
Just
it,
one. Okay. Well,
yeah.
even one. You've written one other book about Jane Jacobs. So, what sort of influenced you to and prompted you to write this one about Scranton?
I it was working on the first book that was for young adults, and it was kind of an introduction to Jane Jacobs and who she was, and simpler and all that sort of thing. It was in order to do that book, I went to Scranton because I wanted to see what it was like. I was curious. My mother's family had grown up not all that far from there, and I knew a little bit about Philadelphia. And I got there, and I was so taken with the place. It kind of made Jane come alive for me,
Mm.
and I thought I I I suspected that it was the key to Jane Jacobs, and I wanted to unpack that and see how it was. And it was a fascinating city also to learn about a once industrial city that had been such a go-to place, so attractive to so many people, how it could have fallen into such disrepair and depression. Really, it had, when I went there, it had half the number of people that it had at its height, and I just found it. It was like all those places in Queens that I'd gone and looked at
Mm.
the industry, of when I was whatever 10 years old, and to be able to find people who remembered that, and could tell me about the mines, and um, you know to
Yeah.
find the little traces, and how you get to that history.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was also, I was curious about my own parents' history. I had one immigrant parent and one very, very working class parent, and
Mm.
I think it's a lot of people's story. And I thought, well, how interesting to learn about the city of the person who was sort of one of the, I don't know, the authorities in my mind on cities.
On
How did
cities.
that person get there? And
Absolutely.
it took a while to dig and get there and feel like I had some sort of sense of it. It was so much fun. No.
I mean, you can see it. It comes through in the writing and the
Nice.
photographs that you include, and just the incredible amount of information that you were able to uncover and put together. And really
It
just
was
that
a
you're,
community project.
which also very in line, I think, with Jane Jacobs' philosophy, right? You worked with longtime residents to see how their perspective of the city, was so crucial. And I think certainly a perfect place to end our conversation, just really with this potential, right, of someone like Jane Jacobs becoming, such a formative voice on urban planning and cities, from her life in Scranton, and really from her belief that anyone can do this work. and inspiration from your work in having sort of an interest in a place and in your family story, and putting that to producing something that's so valuable to understanding Jane Jacobs and her work. So Glenna, thank you so much
Well, thank
for
you, and thank you for your keen insights.
it was a pleasure. And for everyone watching, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciated your questions. There were too many for us to even answer in this hour, so we'll share them with Glenna, and perhaps she can share them out with you after. But please do stay connected to the museum. We have programs on this channel every week. In fact, we have one tomorrow night as well, so tune in tomorrow for more. And we hope to see you at another virtual event soon. So take care, everyone. Good night.